Hello there and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Tonight we're going to explore one of history's most remarkable financial dynasties, the Rothschild family, and separate the fascinating reality from centuries of myth and conspiracy. We'll discover how five brothers built a banking network that financed empires, funded railroads across continents, and shaped the modern world of finance. We'll walk through cobblestone streets in an 18th century ghetto, witness the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, and slowly, carefully, piece together how one family story became intertwined with the economic history of Europe itself. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a sensational exploration of conspiracy theories or a dramatic recounting of intrigue. Instead, we'll move slowly and thoughtfully through 2 centuries of history, through the numbers and the stories, the genuine innovations and the persistent myths. If you drift away, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's begin. Let's start in 1744, in a place that no longer exists in the form it once took. A narrow, cramped street in Frankfurt, Germany, called the Judengasse, the Jewish lane. To understand the Rothschild story, to really grasp how it all began, we need to spend some time in this place, in this world that seems impossibly distant from our own, but whose logic and limitations shaped everything that followed. Picture, if you can, a single street barely 12 feet wide in places, hemmed in by buildings that lean toward each other across the gap like old friends sharing secrets. This street, roughly a quarter-mile long, was home to somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people. The entire Jewish population of Frankfurt, one of the most important commercial cities in what was then called the Holy Roman Empire. They weren't permitted to live anywhere else. The Judengasse wasn't just a neighbourhood. It was a legally enforced boundary, a ghetto in the original sense of the word. The street was locked at night. Gates at either end, secured with heavy chains, kept the residents inside from dusk until dawn. On Sundays and Christian holidays, those gates stayed locked all day. If you were Jewish in Frankfurt, your movements were restricted, your occupations limited, your very presence in the city carefully controlled and grudgingly tolerated. You paid special taxes for the privilege of this confinement. You couldn't own land outside the ghetto. You couldn't farm. You couldn't join most guilds, which meant most trades and crafts were closed to you. So what could you do? You could lend money. You could trade in goods that required minimal physical space and could be moved quickly if necessary. Coins, jewellery, fine textiles. You could become skilled at things that didn't require land or guild membership or Christian approval. You could develop expertise in areas that others found distasteful or complicated, and over generations, over centuries, the Jewish communities of Europe became, by necessity and restriction, specialists in finance and trade. This wasn't because of any innate talent or mystical ability with numbers, despite what centuries of stereotype might suggest. It was simple adaptation to circumstance. When you're forbidden from owning land, you don't become a farmer. When you're excluded from guilds, you don't become a blacksmith or a weaver. When you might need to flee at a moment's notice, and history had taught that this was always a possibility, you invest in things that are portable. Knowledge, skills, relationships, things that can't be confiscated or burned or left behind. Into this world in 1744, Mayor Amschel was born. His father, Moses, was a money changer and trader in silk. The family lived in a house marked with a red shield, Rothschild in German, and eventually that sign became the family name. This was common practice then. Houses had signs instead of numbers, and families took names from those signs. The red shield, Rothschild. Mayor Amschel, let's call him Mayor as his contemporaries did, lost both his parents young. By the time he was 13, both were gone, claimed by illness in that crowded street where disease spread easily and medical care was rudimentary. He was sent to train as a rabbi, but that path didn't suit him. Instead, he returned to Frankfurt and apprenticed with a banking house, learning the intricate business of money changing, of bills of exchange, of the complex financial instruments that kept trade flowing across Europe despite its patchwork of currencies and jurisdictions. But Mayer had a particular interest, almost a passion that set him apart. He collected old coins, not as money, but as historical artifacts. He studied them, learned their provenance, understood their rarity and value to collectors. This might seem like an odd hobby for a young man trying to establish himself in business, but it turned out to be remarkably strategic. Because the aristocrats and princes of German states also collected rare coins. It was a fashionable pursuit among the wealthy, a display of learning and refinement. And this is where Mayer's story begins to reveal his particular genius. Not for banking exactly, not yet, but for patience and relationship building and understanding how to move between worlds. He began to cultivate a relationship with Prince William of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest men in Europe. William's father and grandfather had made a fortune renting Hessian soldiers to foreign powers, including, famously, to the British during the American Revolution. This wasn't slavery exactly, but it wasn't far from it. Soldiers treated as commodities, leased out for profit. The practice made the Hessian princes extraordinarily wealthy. William was a collector of rare coins. Mayer was a dealer in rare coins. The connection seems simple, but remember the context. Mayer was Jewish, confined to the Judengasse, subject to restrictions and discriminations that made every interaction with Christian nobility a careful negotiation. He couldn't simply knock on the palace door and offer his services. He needed patience. He needed to demonstrate value without seeming pushy. He needed to build trust slowly, carefully, over years. Mayer would seek out rare coins for the prince's collection. He would offer them at favourable prices, sometimes at cost or even at a loss. He wasn't trying to make money on these transactions, not immediately. He was investing in something more valuable than profit on a single sale. He was investing in a relationship. He was demonstrating reliability, knowledge, discretion. He was becoming useful, indispensable even. By 1769, 25 years after his birth, Mayer had achieved something remarkable for a Jew in the Judengasse. He had been appointed Crown Agent to Prince William. This was a title, a relationship, a position of trust that opened doors. He could now conduct business more freely. He could serve as the prince's financial advisor, handling investments, managing funds. More importantly, he had established a principle that would guide the Rothschild family for generations. Access to power comes through service, through making yourself useful to those who hold authority. But Mayer understood something else, something that would prove even more important. He understood that the future wouldn't belong to loan financiers, no matter how successful, but to networks, to systems that could move money and information faster and more reliably than anyone else. And the foundation of that network would be family, blood, trust that went deeper than contracts. Mayer married Gutler Schnapper in 1770. She came from a family of merchants and money changers. Together they would have 10 children who survived to adulthood, 5 daughters and 5 sons. The daughters would marry well, creating alliances with other prominent Jewish families in Frankfurt and beyond. But it was the 5 sons who would build the empire Mayer envisioned. Let's take a moment here and consider what life was like in that house in the Judengasse. The building itself would have been narrow and tall, squeezed between neighbours on either side, every inch of space precious. The family lived upstairs, the business operated downstairs, office and counting house and sometimes lodging for apprentices and clerks all mixed together. Privacy was rare. Quiet was rarer still. The street outside was crowded, noisy, alive with commerce and conversation, and the constant press of people living their lives in too small spaces. But there was also warmth, community, a richness of culture and learning that the restrictions couldn't suppress. Scholarship was valued, books were treasured. The synagogue was the centre of social and spiritual life. The Sabbath offered respite from the week's labour. Children grew up immersed in both Jewish tradition and the practical necessities of commerce, learning Torah and Talmud alongside arithmetic and accounting. Meir taught his sons the business from early ages. They learned to evaluate coins and assess their worth. They learned the complex web of currencies that circulated through Europe, gulden and florins, thalers and ducats, each with different weights and purities of silver or gold. They learned how bills of exchange worked, how a merchant in Amsterdam could arrange payment to a supplier in Venice without physically moving gold or silver across hundreds of miles of dangerous roads. They learned that information was valuable, that knowing what was happening in London or Paris before your competitors did could mean the difference between profit and loss. And they learned, perhaps most importantly, that they were building something that would outlast any one of them. Meir had a vision, though he couldn't have articulated it fully even to himself. He understood that his sons, properly positioned, properly coordinated, could create something unprecedented. A banking house that operated simultaneously in multiple cities, that could move money across borders while European states were constantly at war with each other, that could serve multiple princes and governments because it was everywhere and loyal only to family. This was the soil, restrictive, discriminatory, but also instructive, in which the Rothschild dynasty took root. Meir was building something in the shadows of those Judengasse walls, something that would eventually dwarf the palaces of the princes he served. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1790, as the 18th century drew toward its close, Meir Amschel Rothschild was a successful Jewish financier in Frankfurt, respected within his community, useful to powerful clients, prosperous by the standards of the Judengasse, but hardly wealthy by the standards of European nobility. The world was about to change. Revolution was erupting in France, sending shock waves across Europe. The old certainties were crumbling. War was coming, decades of war that would reshape the continent, and in that chaos, in that upheaval, the Rothschild family would find their opportunity. But that comes later in our story. For now, picture that narrow street, that crowded house, those 5 sons learning their father's business and preparing, though they didn't know it yet, to leave Frankfurt and establish themselves in the great capitals of Europe. Let that image settle for a moment. There's no rush. We have the whole night ahead of us to explore how this family transformed from restricted ghetto merchants into architects of modern finance. As the 1790s gave way to the 1800s, as the new century arrived with all its tumult and promise, Meir Amschel Rothschild was making decisions that would shape not just his family's future, but the architecture of international finance itself. He was watching his sons grow into men, each developing his own temperament and talents, and he was thinking not about what they could accomplish together in Frankfurt, but about what they could achieve if they spread across Europe like a carefully woven net. Let's meet these 5 young men, because their personalities and their placements would define the Rothschild network for generations. The eldest, Amschel Meir, born in 1773, would stay in Frankfurt. He was the careful one, the traditional one, deeply connected to the Jewish community and the old ways of the ghetto. He would maintain the original house, keep the home fires burning, serve as the anchor while his brothers ventured into the wider world. Salomon Meir, born in 1774, had a gift for diplomacy, for navigating the complex politics of European courts. He would eventually establish himself in Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Empire, perhaps the most tradition-bound and aristocratic of all European cities. Nathan Meir, born in 1777, was the most ambitious, the most aggressive in business, the one who saw opportunities where others saw only risk. He would go to England, to Manchester first, and then to London. And he would build the most powerful of all the Rothschild branches. Karl Meir, born in 1788, was the youngest to establish his own branch, and he would make his way to Naples, in what was then the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. And finally, James Meir, the baby of the family, born in 1792, would establish himself in Paris, eventually becoming known as Baron James de Rothschild. the most thoroughly assimilated into aristocratic society of all the brothers. 5 brothers, 5 cities, Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Naples, Paris. This was Mayer's vision, though it would take years to fully realise. He understood something that seems obvious to us now but was revolutionary then. He understood that money was information, that finance was fundamentally about knowing things, who needed capital, who had it, where the opportunities were, what the risks looked like. And in an age when news travelled at the speed of horses, when a letter from London to Vienna might take weeks, a coordinated network of family members who trusted each other completely could have an almost magical advantage. Think about the communication challenges they faced. This was before telegraphs, before telephones, before anything we would recognise as modern communication technology. A message from one brother to another had to be written by hand, sealed, entrusted to a courier who would travel by horse or coach over terrible roads, through territories that might be at war, across borders where guards might stop and search everything. The fastest possible communication between London and Frankfurt was about 4 to 5 days under ideal conditions. London to Vienna might take 2 weeks, and these were one-way journeys. If you wanted a reply, you had to double that time. Moreover, there was no secure postal service as we understand it. Letters might be opened by suspicious customs officials. Information might be stolen by competitors. The very act of communicating sensitive financial information across borders was risky. So the Rothschilds developed their own courier system, their own trusted messengers who carried letters in specially designed pouches, who travelled with multiple copies in case one was lost or stolen, who knew to take circuitous routes to avoid checkpoints or danger. But even the best courier system couldn't overcome the fundamental limitation of the era: slowness. So the network had to operate on the basis of trust. Each brother needed the authority to make decisions on behalf of the family without waiting for approval from his brothers. Each needed to trust that his brothers were making similar decisions with the family's best interests at heart. This is where blood, literal family connection, became the crucial advantage. You might trust a business partner or an employee, but you trust a brother in a different, deeper way. The first to leave Frankfurt was Nathan, and his story captures something essential about the Rothschild approach to expansion. In 1800, when Nathan was 23 years old, Mayer sent him to England. Not to London initially, but to Manchester, the heart of England's textile industry. England was industrialising rapidly, its factories hungry for raw cotton, and its warehouses full of finished textiles looking for markets. Nathan's job was to serve as a commercial agent, buying textiles for export to the continent, facilitating trade. Imagine Nathan arriving in Manchester, a young Jewish man from Frankfurt's ghetto stepping into one of the most dynamic commercial cities in the world. Manchester in 1800 was grimy, loud, transforming itself from a provincial town into an industrial powerhouse. The textile mills were revolutionising production, but they needed capital, needed financing for equipment and inventory, needed credit arrangements to smooth the flow of raw materials in and finished goods out. Nathan didn't speak fluent English when he arrived. He lived simply, worked constantly, and demonstrated the same patient relationship building his father had perfected in Frankfurt. But Nathan also had an aggression, a hunger for success that pushed him beyond his father's cautious approach. Within a few years, he had established himself not just as a textile merchant, but as a banker, extending credit to manufacturers, arranging financing for trade. And within 7 years, by 1807, he had moved to London and established N.M. Rothschild and Sons, the banking house that would become the most powerful financial institution in the world. London then was already the world's largest city, with a population approaching 1 million people. It was the capital of an empire that was spreading across the globe, holdings in India, colonies in the Caribbean, growing influence in Africa, naval supremacy that controlled the seas. The City of London, that square mile of narrow streets around the old Roman walls, was the financial centre of this empire, home to the Bank of England and dozens of private banking houses and merchant firms. Nathan set up offices on New Court St Swithin's Lane, an address that would remain the London Rothschild headquarters for over 2 centuries. The building itself was modest, nothing like the grand palaces the family would later inhabit. It was a working space, a counting house where clerks perched on high stools scratching figures into ledgers, where strong boxes held bills of exchange and government bonds, where Nathan himself would stand at his accustomed spot by a pillar, receiving information and making decisions with a speed that impressed and sometimes frightened his competitors. Meanwhile, his brothers were taking their own positions. James, the youngest, went to Paris in 1811, when he was barely 19 years old. France under Napoleon was both an enemy to Britain. The two nations were locked in what seemed like endless war, and a crucial part of the European economy. Paris was a city of over 500,000 people, the cultural capital of Europe, home to the Bourse where government securities traded, a city of boulevards and cafes and salons where ideas and capital circulated together. James had perhaps the most difficult assignment. France was at war with much of Europe, including with Britain, where his brother Nathan was establishing himself. Suspicion of foreigners was high. The Jewish community in France, while legally emancipated since the Revolution, still faced social discrimination. But James had charm and ambition. He began, like Nathan, by facilitating trade, moving goods between France and the rest of Europe despite the war, finding the gaps in Napoleon's continental system that tried to blockade British trade. And then, gradually, he began to handle financial transactions, to build relationships with French government officials and ministers who needed the services that only an internationally connected banker could provide. Salomon went to Vienna, which required perhaps even more delicate diplomacy than Paris. Vienna was the capital of the Austrian Empire, one of the most aristocratic and tradition-bound societies in Europe. The imperial court, under Emperor Francis, maintained elaborate protocols and hierarchies. The idea of a Jewish banker from Frankfurt's ghetto establishing himself at the heart of this world seemed almost absurd. But Salomon had patience and political instincts. He began by making himself useful, by providing financial services that the Habsburg Empire desperately needed as it fought repeated wars against Napoleon's France. Karl's assignment to Naples came later, in the 1820s, after the Napoleonic Wars had ended. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which included both Naples and Sicily, was backward compared to northern Europe but strategically important, controlling the southern Italian peninsula and serving as a buffer between Austrian interests and the Mediterranean. Karl's job was to establish a presence there, to provide banking services to the Bourbon kings who ruled Naples, to extend the Rothschild network southward. And Amschel, the eldest, remained in Frankfurt, maintaining the original family business, serving as the point of continuity. He never married, devoted his life entirely to the firm and to the Jewish community in Frankfurt. He served as the ethical centre of the family, the one who remembered where they came from even as his brothers moved into palaces and received titles from grateful monarchs. Now let's pause and consider what this network meant in practical terms. Imagine you're a European government in the early 1800s, and you need to move a large sum of money from one country to another, say, from London to Vienna. The normal method would be to physically transport gold or silver, loading it onto wagons or ships, hiring armed guards, accepting the risk of theft or loss, enduring the weeks or months required to actually move the physical metal across Europe. But with the Rothschild network, there was another option. You could deposit the money with Nathan in London. He would send a letter, coded, carried by trusted courier, to Salomon in Vienna. Salomon would pay out the equivalent amount in Vienna, and the transaction would be complete without a single gold coin crossing borders. The accounts between the brothers would be settled eventually, through the constant flow of transactions that moved money in both directions, but no single payment required physical transport of bullion. This was called a bill of exchange, and it wasn't a new concept. Italian bankers had developed similar instruments in the Middle Ages. But what made the Rothschild system different was its scope and reliability. They operated in all the major financial centres simultaneously. They trusted each other absolutely. They had the capital to handle large transactions, and they moved information faster than anyone else, which meant they could identify arbitrage opportunities, differences in prices between markets, and profit from them before those differences disappeared. Let's think about this information advantage more carefully, because it was perhaps their greatest asset. Imagine that news breaks in London that affects the price of Austrian government bonds. Nathan in London hears this news immediately. His office is in the city, connected to all the major news sources and merchant houses. He can act on this news instantly, buying or selling positions. But more importantly, he can send word to Salomon in Vienna, who won't hear the news through normal channels for perhaps 2 weeks. Salomon can position himself ahead of the market before the news arrives and everyone else reacts. This wasn't illegal. Insider trading laws didn't exist then, but it was extraordinarily profitable. And it was only possible because the brothers trusted each other to share information honestly, to act in the family's collective interest rather than pursuing individual advantage. A network of business partners might do the same thing, but the temptation to cheat, to keep valuable information to yourself, would be enormous. Brothers, raised together, bound by ties of blood and family honour, were far less likely to betray each other. The brothers wrote to each other constantly, multiple letters every week, sometimes multiple letters in a single day when events were moving quickly. These letters mixed personal news, how the children were doing, health concerns, family gossip, with detailed business information. They developed their own code for sensitive information, using Hebrew characters to write German or French words, creating a cipher that would be difficult for interceptors to decode. They commented on political developments, on the personalities of the ministers and monarchs they dealt with, on opportunities they saw emerging. And slowly, year by year, they built not just wealth but influence. When governments needed loans, and governments in this era were constantly fighting wars, constantly in need of capital, they came to the Rothschilds. When aristocrats needed to move money discreetly, they used the Rothschild network. When merchants needed trade finance, letters of credit that would be honoured across Europe, they turned to the family that had brothers in every major city. The network became indispensable. It became infrastructure. This is crucial to understand. The Rothschilds didn't control European finance through force or conspiracy. They made themselves so useful, so efficient, so reliable that people chose to work with them. They filled a need that existing institutions couldn't meet. In an age of constant war and political upheaval, of borders that shifted and governments that rose and fell, the Rothschild network remained constant, functional, trustworthy. That was their genius. By 1815, by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, all 5 brothers were established in their respective cities. Mayor Amschel, the patriarch, had died in 1812, not living to see the full realization of his vision, but knowing that the foundation was solid. His widow, Gutley, would live until 1849, long enough to see her sons become the most powerful banking family in Europe. She never left Frankfurt, never abandoned the Judengasse even after the ghetto walls came down. She remained the family matriarch, the connection to their origins, even as her sons built palaces and received noble titles. The 5 brothers were no longer just merchants from Frankfurt's Jewish quarter. They were becoming powers in their own right, financiers who could make or break government budgets, whose support or opposition could determine whether a nation could afford to wage war or had to sue for peace. But they remained always a family. They visited each other when they could. They celebrated holidays together when possible. They arranged marriages between their children to strengthen the bonds between branches. They never forgot that everything they had built rested on that foundation of blood and trust, that network of 5 brothers spread across Europe, connected by couriers and letters and the unbreakable bonds of family. Let that image rest for a moment. 5 men in 5 great cities. separated by hundreds of miles but working as one, building something unprecedented in the history of finance. The Europe that the Rothschild brothers operated in during the first 2 decades of the 1800s was a continent at war. Not the occasional conflict between rival states, but total war. War that consumed entire nations. War that lasted for years without pause. War that redrew the map of Europe repeatedly and dramatically. At the centre of this maelstrom was Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican artillery officer who had risen through revolution and coup to crown himself Emperor of the French in 1804. Napoleon's ambitions were continental in scope. He envisioned a Europe unified under French dominance, with himself as the new Charlemagne, the successor to Rome's glory. To achieve this vision required armies, vast conscript armies that dwarfed anything Europe had seen before. The old system of small professional forces gave way to mass mobilization. Hundreds of thousands of men marched under Napoleon's tricolour banners, fighting in Spain and Italy, in Austria and Prussia, eventually pushing deep into Russia itself. War on this scale required money. Enormous amounts of money. Armies needed uniforms, weapons, ammunition, food, transport, pay for soldiers, pensions for widows, hospitals for the wounded. Navies needed ships, which were perhaps even more expensive than land forces. A single ship of the line, one of those massive sailing warships with 3 decks of cannon, cost as much to build as a small palace and required hundreds of sailors to crew. Governments spent money faster than they could collect it through taxes, which meant they had to borrow. They issued bonds promising to repay with interest, hoping that investors would have faith in their ability to survive and honour their debts. This was where the Rothschilds found their greatest opportunity. War disrupted normal commerce, made traditional banking dangerous and difficult. But war also created desperate need for exactly the services the Rothschild network could provide. Moving money across battle lines, converting currencies when borders shifted and new governments took power, providing the capital that kept armies in the field. They weren't taking sides exactly, not in any ideological sense. They were providing financial services to whoever needed them and could pay for them. Let's be clear about something, because this is where the Rothschild story becomes morally complex and where we need to proceed with care and honesty. The brothers profited from war. They didn't start wars, didn't advocate for them, but when wars happened, and wars were happening constantly, they made money by financing them. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge, because we can see the human cost of those conflicts even from our distant perspective. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died in the Napoleonic Wars, civilians suffered, economies were shattered, and the Rothschilds grew wealthy facilitating the financial mechanisms that made this possible. They weren't unique in this. All bankers, all merchants who supplied armies, all manufacturers who made uniforms or weapons, everyone involved in the military-industrial complex of the era was in some sense profiting from death and suffering. The Rothschilds were just better at it, more efficient, more successful. But we shouldn't romanticize this or pretend it was somehow noble. They were businessmen who saw opportunity in chaos, and they seized it. The British government became one of Nathan's most important clients. Britain was fighting Napoleon almost continuously from 1803 to 1815, with only one brief pause in 1802 to 1803. Britain's strategy was to subsidise coalitions of continental powers to fight France on land, while the Royal Navy controlled the seas. This meant constantly sending gold to Austria, to Prussia, to Russia, paying them to keep armies in the field against Napoleon. The problem was getting that gold to them. You couldn't simply load ships with gold and sail them to European ports. Napoleon controlled most of the continental coastline. French privateers prowled the seas. The continental system, Napoleon's attempt to blockade all trade with Britain, meant that ships arriving in European ports might be seized. So the British government needed someone who could move gold overland, through territories that were sometimes hostile, sometimes shifting between French and anti-French control, always dangerous and uncertain. Nathan Rothschild proposed a solution. His brothers were positioned in cities across Europe. They had relationships with merchants and bankers in neutral territories. They had couriers who knew the routes and the risks. Nathan could receive gold in London, and through a complex series of transfers and transactions, ensure that equivalent funds reached British allies on the continent. Not by physically moving the gold across France, that would be impossible, but by using bills of exchange, by buying and selling commodities, by working through intermediaries in neutral states like the German principalities that were nominally allied with Napoleon, but whose merchants still traded quietly with both sides. The British government paid handsomely for this service, but more than the immediate profit, the relationship gave Nathan something priceless: the confidence and trust of the British Treasury. He was making himself indispensable to the British war effort. And after the wars ended, that relationship would continue, would expand, would become the foundation of the London Rothschilds' dominance in British government finance for the next century. The other brothers were doing similar work for their respective governments. Salomon in Vienna helped finance Austria's repeated campaigns against Napoleon. James in Paris, and this required extraordinary delicacy, managed to maintain relationships with French officials even while his brother in London was helping finance Napoleon's enemies. Karl in Naples dealt with the complex politics of Italy, where states shifted allegiance repeatedly as French armies advanced and retreated and advanced again. The network was proving its value. Information flowed between the brothers. If Nathan learned that Britain was planning a new subsidy to Austria, he could inform Salomon, who could position himself to handle the transaction. If James heard rumours of French military movements, he could warn his brothers, allowing them to adjust their positions in government bonds that would rise or fall based on military outcomes. The speed and reliability of their information network gave them an advantage that compounded with every transaction. Now, we need to address the most famous story in Rothschild history. The legend that has been told and retold and embellished until separating fact from fiction becomes nearly impossible. This is the story of Nathan Rothschild and the Battle of Waterloo, and we need to approach it carefully, with skepticism and with recognition that what became legend may have only the barest connection to historical truth. The backdrop is this. By 1815, Napoleon had been defeated, exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. The great powers of Europe, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia were gathered in Vienna, redrawing the map of Europe, trying to establish a lasting peace. And then, in March of 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba, returned to France, and within weeks had raised a new army. The exiled Bourbon king fled, and Napoleon was once again emperor. The powers at Vienna immediately declared him an outlaw and mobilized their armies for one final confrontation. That confrontation came on June 18th, 1815. Near a small Belgian village called Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington commanded an Anglo-Allied army. Gebhard Lebrecht von Blücher commanded Prussian forces. Napoleon commanded the French. The battle lasted all day, a brutal grinding struggle in muddy fields. At times, Napoleon seemed to be winning. Then the Prussians arrived to reinforce Wellington, and the French army broke, fleeing in disorder. Napoleon's final gamble had failed. Within weeks he would abdicate again, this time exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would die 6 years later. The legend says that Nathan Rothschild, through his network of couriers, learned the outcome of the battle before anyone else in London. While others still didn't know whether Wellington had won or lost, Nathan supposedly knew, and he supposedly used this information to make an enormous profit in British government bonds called consols. The details vary depending on who's telling the story. Some versions say he started selling consols, making everyone think Britain had lost, causing a panic that drove prices down, then buying up vast quantities at the depressed prices before the real news arrived that Britain had won, after which prices soared. Other versions say he simply started buying before anyone else knew the outcome, securing his position before the market could react. Here's what we can say with reasonable historical confidence. Nathan did have an excellent courier network. He did receive news of Waterloo's outcome quickly, possibly before the British government did, though this is disputed. He did trade in government bonds, and he likely did make a profit from knowing the outcome early. But the dramatic version of the story, the deliberate deception, the market manipulation, the fortune made in a single day, this appears to be largely mythical, an embellishment that grew in the telling over decades and centuries. The myth serves several purposes, most of them not particularly flattering to the Rothschilds. It portrays Nathan as manipulative, deceptive, willing to profit from national crisis. It feeds into anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jewish financial manipulation. And it vastly exaggerates both the profit he made and the degree of control he had over British financial markets. In reality, the London bond market in 1815 was large and sophisticated, with many players. Nathan was important, but not omnipotent. He couldn't single-handedly cause a market panic or manipulate prices the way the legend suggests. What likely happened was something more prosaic but still impressive. Nathan's courier arrived in London with news of Wellington's victory, probably on June 20th, 2 days after the battle. This was fast, remarkably fast for the era. Nathan may have had this information several hours before official dispatches reached the government. He may have used those hours to adjust his positions, buying bonds that he knew would rise when the news became public. This would be a substantial advantage, but not the stuff of legend. The importance of Waterloo for our story isn't really about Nathan's mythical market coup. It's about what the battle represented, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the beginning of a long peace in Europe. The Congress of Vienna had been interrupted by Napoleon's return, but now it could conclude its work. The map of Europe was redrawn. The German states were reorganized into a loose confederation. Poland was divided among the great powers. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in France. The principle of legitimacy, that thrones belonged to their traditional royal houses, was reasserted across Europe. This new order, called the Concert of Europe, would maintain relative peace for the next 40 years. There would be smaller conflicts, revolutions, crises, but nothing like the total war of the Napoleonic era. And this peace created the conditions for the Rothschilds to truly flourish. In wartime, they had proven their ability to move money and information under the most difficult circumstances. In peacetime, those same abilities could be applied to financing reconstruction, development, the infrastructure and industry that would transform Europe over the 19th century. The years immediately after Waterloo were particularly profitable. Governments across Europe needed to restructure their war debts, convert temporary loans into long-term bonds, stabilize their finances. The Rothschilds handled many of these transactions, charging fees for their services, building relationships with finance ministers and treasuries across the continent. They helped stabilize the French government's finances after Napoleon's final defeat, making it possible for the restored Bourbon monarchy to function. They handled loans for Prussia, for Austria, for Naples. Nathan in London was becoming the dominant figure in British government finance. The British government had accumulated enormous debt fighting Napoleon. The national debt had roughly tripled during the wars. Managing this debt, refinancing it at favourable rates, maintaining investor confidence, these were crucial tasks, and Nathan increasingly became the government's go-to banker for these operations. He understood the bond markets intimately. He had the capital to underwrite large issues, and he had the international connections to place British government bonds with investors across Europe. The pattern that had begun during the wars continued and intensified in peace. The Rothschilds made themselves indispensable. They didn't control governments, that's a myth, but they influenced them through the power of capital. A government that needed to borrow money had to offer terms that would be acceptable to major banking houses like the Rothschilds. This gave the bankers leverage, ability to negotiate, to insist on certain policies or reforms in exchange for providing financing. It wasn't control, but it was influence. and in practical terms that influence could be substantial. Consider what this meant from the perspective of a European government in the 1820s. You wanted to build railroads, or fund military reforms, or manage a budget deficit. You needed capital. You could try to raise it domestically through taxes or domestic borrowing. But this had limits. Foreign capital was attractive. It came with fewer immediate political costs. But foreign investors wanted assurance that their investments were safe, that they would be repaid with interest. Who could provide that assurance? Who could convince British investors to buy Austrian bonds, or French investors to buy Prussian bonds? The Rothschilds, with their network, with their reputation, with their ability to evaluate and vouch for sovereign credit. This is how financial power works, and it's worth pausing to consider it because the mechanism is less dramatic than legends suggest, but in some ways more significant. The Rothschilds didn't command armies. They didn't write laws. They didn't have formal political authority, but they controlled access to capital, and in a world where governments constantly needed more capital than they could raise domestically, this gave them influence that was subtle, pervasive, and extraordinarily durable. The Napoleonic Wars had been terrible, decades of slaughter and destruction that killed hundreds of thousands and devastated economies across Europe. But from the ruins, from the chaos, the Rothschild family had emerged as the most powerful banking dynasty in the world. They had proven their system worked under the worst possible conditions. They had built relationships with governments that would last for generations. They had demonstrated that their network of 5 brothers in 5 cities could accomplish what no single banking house could match. The wars were over. The era of Rothschild dominance was just beginning. Let that settle, the transformation from Frankfurt merchants to powers in European finance, accomplished in barely 2 decades, built on family trust and financial innovation, and the terrible opportunities that war created. The peace that settled over Europe after 1815 was a cautious, fragile thing at first. People who had lived through 2 decades of war didn't quite trust that the fighting was truly over. But as months became years, as the Congress of Vienna's settlement held, as Napoleon died in exile on St. Helena in 1821, Europeans began to believe that perhaps this peace might last. And they began to think about building rather than destroying, about development rather than defense, about prosperity rather than mere survival. This was the world the Rothschilds now inhabited, and it suited them far better than war had. Despite the profits war had brought, peace meant stability, predictability, the possibility of long-term planning. It meant that loans made to governments were more likely to be repaid. It meant that investments in infrastructure and industry could mature and bear fruit. The skills the family had developed, moving capital across borders, evaluating sovereign credit, maintaining relationships with governments, were just as valuable in peacetime. Perhaps more so. The 5 brothers were entering their prime. Nathan in London was in his late 40s at the height of his powers, respected and feared in the city, the dominant figure in British government finance. James in Paris was establishing himself as the preeminent banker to the restored Bourbon monarchy, and then, after the Revolution of 1830, to the July monarchy under Louis Philippe. Salomon in Vienna had the ear of the Austrian Empire's finance ministers. Karl in Naples handled the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies' finances. Amschel in Frankfurt maintained the Home Office and the family's connection to their roots. But something else was happening, something that would have seemed impossible when Meyer Amschel was a coin dealer in the Frankfurt ghetto. The brothers were being ennobled. They were receiving titles from grateful monarchs, being admitted, partially conditionally, but nonetheless admitted, into European aristocracy. This transformation, this metamorphosis from ghetto Jews to barons and peers, is one of the most remarkable aspects of their story, and worth exploring carefully, because it reveals much about both the Rothschilds and the societies they operated in. In 1816, Austria granted Salomon a hereditary baronetcy. In 1818, all 5 brothers were ennobled by Austria, becoming barons of the empire, the von Rothschilds. Nathan, operating in Britain, would eventually be succeeded by his son Lionel, who would become the first Jewish member of Parliament. James in Paris would marry into the aristocracy and accumulate titles and estates that made him indistinguishable, at least superficially, from the old nobility he had once served. These weren't empty honours. They came with real social elevation, access to court, the right to own land, to participate in aspects of aristocratic life that had been closed to Jews. But they also came with contradictions and limitations. The Rothschilds were noble, yes, but they were also Jewish, and European anti-Semitism didn't disappear just because a few wealthy families received titles. They were accepted in business, tolerated at court, but never entirely integrated into the higher circles of European society. There were clubs that wouldn't admit them, social events they weren't invited to, marriages that remained out of reach despite their wealth. The family's response to this situation was practical and strategic. They would accept the honours offered, would build the palaces and accumulate the art collections that aristocrats were expected to have, would learn to hunt and to host and to perform aristocracy. But they would also remain Jewish, would maintain their connections to Jewish communities, would marry almost exclusively within the family or with other prominent Jewish families. They would be barons, yes, but they would also be Rothschilds, a category unto themselves. Let's talk about railroads, because this is where the Rothschilds truly shaped the physical transformation of Europe. Railways were the transformative technology of the 19th century, the equivalent of the internet in our own time, infrastructure that would reshape economies, societies, the very landscape itself. The first practical steam locomotive was developed in the 1810s. By the 1820s, the first passenger railways were opening in Britain. By the 1830s and 40s, railway fever had spread across Europe and the Americas. Building railways required enormous amounts of capital. A single line might cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. Miles of track had to be laid, bridges built, tunnels cut through hills, stations constructed, locomotives and cars manufactured. No individual could finance a railway. Joint stock companies were formed, shares sold to investors, but these companies also needed loans, needed underwriters who would guarantee bond issues, needed banks that could manage the complex financial arrangements required to keep construction moving forward. The Rothschilds became the premier railway financiers in Europe. They didn't just lend money, they took ownership stakes, sat on boards of directors, influenced route selection and technical decisions. The Chemin de Fer du Nord, the Northern Railway of France connecting Paris to the Belgian border, was substantially a Rothschild creation, with James in Paris as the driving force behind its financing and construction. In Austria, Salomon financed the Kaiser Ferdinand's Nordbahn, the empire's first major railway line. In Britain, Nathan and later his sons financed numerous railway projects, though Britain's railway development was more fragmented, with multiple competing companies and less Rothschild dominance than on the continent. The profits from railway financing were substantial, but more than that, railways gave the Rothschilds influence over economic development in ways that went beyond banking, where railways went. Cities grew, markets expanded, natural resources became accessible. The Rothschilds weren't just financing infrastructure, they were shaping which regions would prosper, which industries would develop, which cities would thrive. This was power of a different sort than moving money during wartime. This was the power to literally build the future. They also invested in mining, coal and iron ore, copper and mercury, the raw materials of industrialization. The Rothschilds acquired mines in Spain, in Austria, in France. They didn't operate these mines directly typically, but owned them or held substantial stakes in the companies that did. These investments were long-term, requiring patience and capital that could be tied up for years before returning profit. But the Rothschilds had both patience and capital in abundance, and the returns, when they came, were substantial. Let's pause and consider what daily life might have looked like for James de Rothschild in Paris in, say, 1840. He would wake in his mansion on the Rue Lafitte, a palace by any reasonable standard, filled with art and staffed by dozens of servants. His day would begin with correspondence, letters from his brothers, from business associates, from government officials. He would read newspapers from across Europe, staying informed about political developments, market movements, anything that might affect his business interests. He might spend his morning at his office, meeting with ministers who needed advice on government finance, with industrialists seeking funding for new ventures, with fellow bankers coordinating on large transactions. He would make decisions about which loans to extend, which investments to make, which risks to take, and which to avoid. His word could make or break companies, could determine whether a government could finance its budget or face crisis. His afternoons might be spent at the Bourse, the Paris Stock Exchange, or meeting with politicians at the Chamber of Deputies. His evenings would be social, dinners with aristocrats, attendance at the opera, hosting salons where artists and intellectuals mixed with financiers and nobles. His wife, Betty, was his Uncle Salomon's daughter. The Rothschilds married within the family to keep wealth concentrated and maintain the closeness of the clan. Together they were raising children who would inherit not just wealth, but position, who would be trained from birth to manage the family's interests. This life combined elements that seem incompatible to us now: the intense, calculating world of high finance with the refined leisure of aristocracy. James would discuss railway financing over dinner, would negotiate government loans between courses, but would do so while wearing perfect evening dress, while serving the finest wines, while surrounded by masterpieces of art. The performance of aristocracy required this fusion of business and leisure, this ability to make millions while appearing to be merely enjoying oneself. The art collections deserve particular mention. The Rothschilds became among the greatest art collectors and patrons of the 19th century. They bought old masters, Rembrandts and Vermeers, Titians and Rubens. They commissioned works from contemporary artists. They built libraries filled with rare manuscripts and illuminated texts. Their palaces became museums, open to scholars and sometimes to the public, contributing to the cultural life of their cities. This wasn't just ostentation, though there was certainly an element of display. Art collecting was how aristocrats demonstrated their refinement, their education, their worthiness to hold elevated social position. A baron was expected to have a gallery, a library, a collection that showed good taste and learning. The Rothschilds, having been elevated to baronial rank, performed these expectations perhaps more thoroughly than the old nobility, proving their right to the titles they held. But there was also genuine appreciation, genuine love of beauty and culture. Several family members were serious scholars and connoisseurs. They supported artists, funded archaeological expeditions, donated pieces to public museums. Their collecting helped preserve works that might otherwise have been lost or destroyed. This was patronage in the Renaissance sense, using wealth to advance culture and knowledge. Their estates multiplied across Europe. Salomon built a palace in Vienna. James had multiple chateaux in France, most famously Ferrières, which took 5 years to build and was among the largest and most elaborate private residences in France. The English Rothschilds would eventually accumulate vast country estates. Waddesdon Manor, built by Ferdinand de Rothschild in the 1870s and 80s, was a Renaissance-style chateau transplanted to the English countryside, filled with French furniture and art, surrounded by gardens that rivaled Versailles. These weren't just homes. They were statements of arrival, demonstrations that the Rothschilds had achieved what their grandfather mayor could never have imagined: integration, if not complete acceptance, into the highest levels of European society. A visitor to Ferrières or Waddesdon might forget temporarily that these palaces belonged to a family that 3 generations earlier had been confined to a narrow ghetto street in Frankfurt. The paradox of their position, Jewish origins and Christian aristocracy, played out in complex ways. European society in the 19th century was deeply Christian, and anti-Semitism, while it varied in intensity across time and place, was always present to some degree. The Rothschilds could be useful, could be wealthy, could even be noble, but they could not entirely escape the social consequences of being Jewish. Some aristocrats refused to associate with them socially despite doing business with them. Some maintained that no amount of wealth or titles could truly make a Jew equal to Christian nobility. And some, particularly as the century progressed and new forms of racial anti-Semitism emerged, viewed the Rothschilds as symptoms of Jewish infiltration and corruption of Christian society. The conspiracy theories that would become so virulent in the 20th century were already taking shape in the 19th. The family's response, as mentioned earlier, was to maintain Jewish identity while performing aristocracy. They attended synagogue, though their religious observance was often moderate or reform rather than orthodox. They supported Jewish causes, funded synagogues and schools, helped Jewish communities facing persecution. They married within the family or with other prominent Jewish families like the Montefiores, the Goldsmids, the Wertheimer. This created a small, interconnected network of Jewish banking families that maintained their distinct identity even as they moved in aristocratic circles. Consider Lionel de Rothschild's election to Parliament in 1847. He won his seat representing the City of London, but he couldn't take his seat because members of Parliament were required to take an oath. Lionel refused to swear this oath. He was re-elected repeatedly, 11 times in total, and each time he appeared at Parliament, and each time he was denied his seat. This went on for 11 years until Parliament finally, in 1858, modified the oath to allow Jews to serve. Lionel's persistence, his refusal to convert or to simply accept exclusion, made him a symbol of Jewish rights and integration. Yet even this victory was partial. Lionel could sit in Parliament, but his Jewishness remained a factor in how he was perceived and treated. The barriers were lowering, but they hadn't disappeared. And in some parts of Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe and Russia, they remained as high as ever. The Rothschilds' success was exceptional, not representative of Jewish experience generally. By the 1850s, as we approached the middle of the 19th century, the Rothschilds stood at the pinnacle of European finance. They had survived the transition from war to peace, from the 18th century to the 19th, from ghetto merchants to barons and peers. Their network of 5 houses in 5 cities, though Karl had died in 1855 and the Naples branch would eventually close, while the Vienna, London, Paris and Frankfurt branches continued, functioned as a kind of international financial institution before such institutions formally existed. They were lenders to governments across Europe. They financed the infrastructure, railways and mines and factories that was transforming the continent from agricultural to industrial. They influenced policy through their control of capital. They collected art and built palaces and married into aristocracy. They had achieved, in material terms, everything that success could mean in 19th century Europe. Yet they remained Jewish, remained apart in subtle and not so subtle ways, remained both exemplars of integration and evidence of its limits. The golden age of the Rothschilds was at its height, but already, barely visible on the horizon, forces were gathering that would challenge their position, would reveal the fragility of the world they had built. But that comes later in our story. For now, picture James in his Paris mansion, Nathan in his London office, Salomon in his Viennese palace, 5 brothers and their descendants, connected by blood and by business, shaping the economic transformation of Europe, living in a contradiction between their origins and their achievements, between acceptance and exclusion, between power and vulnerability. While the Rothschilds were building their palaces in Europe, while they were financing railways across the continent and accumulating titles and estates, there was another part of the world where their story developed differently, where their model didn't quite transplant, where the future of finance was being shaped by forces they influenced but never controlled. That place was America. This is worth exploring carefully, because the American experience reveals something important about the limits of the Rothschild system and about the nature of American capitalism itself. The question isn't why the Rothschilds failed in America. That's too strong a word. The question is why they chose a different approach there, why they never established one of their great banking houses in New York or Philadelphia the way they had in London and Paris, and what this decision tells us about both the family and the young nation across the Atlantic. The United States in the 1820s and 30s, when the Rothschilds were at the height of their European influence, was still a relatively minor player in global finance. The nation was young, the constitution was barely 40 years old, the population was small compared to European powers, perhaps 13 million people in 1830, when Britain alone had 24 million. The economy was primarily agricultural, though beginning to industrialise in the northeast. There was no central bank after President Andrew Jackson destroyed the second bank of the United States in the 1830s. The financial system was fragmented, with state-chartered banks operating with minimal federal oversight. But America was also growing explosively. The Louisiana Purchase had doubled the nation's territory. Settlers were pushing westward across the Appalachians into the Ohio Valley, eventually to the Mississippi and beyond. This expansion required infrastructure, roads, canals, and eventually railways. It required capital, more capital than the young nation could generate domestically. European investment, particularly British investment, would be crucial to American development throughout the 19th century. The Rothschilds certainly saw the opportunities. America needed exactly what they specialised in: large-scale infrastructure financing, international capital flows, the kind of long-term investment in railways and development that they were funding across Europe. Nathan in London was particularly well positioned to channel British capital to American ventures, serving as intermediary between British investors seeking returns and American enterprises seeking funds. But they chose not to send one of the brothers, or even one of the next generation, to establish a permanent Rothschild house in America. Instead, they worked through agents, through partner banks, through representatives who operated under their own names, while maintaining close ties to the family. The most important of these representatives was a man named August Belmont, and his story illuminates both the American opportunity and why the Rothschilds approached it indirectly. August Belmont was born August Schönberg in the Rhenish Palatinate, part of what was then the German Confederation, in 1813 or 1814. The records are unclear. He came from a Jewish family of modest means. At 14 or 15, he began working as an apprentice for the Rothschilds' Frankfurt house, sweeping floors and learning the basics of banking. He was bright, ambitious, tireless, exactly the kind of young man the Rothschilds often recruited and trained. He learned languages. He would eventually speak English, French, German, and Italian fluently. He learned the intricacies of bills of exchange, of trade finance, of how the Rothschild network actually operated. In 1837, when he was about 23, the Rothschilds sent him to Havana, Cuba, to represent their interests there. This was a minor posting, a chance to gain experience in a relatively safe environment. But on the ship from Europe to Cuba, Belmont struck up conversations with American businessmen. He became intrigued by the possibilities in the United States. When he arrived in Havana and found that the financial situation there was less promising than expected, he made a decision that would change his life. He continued on to New York. This required audacity. He hadn't been authorized to go to New York, hadn't been instructed to establish operations there. But he understood the Rothschild system well enough to know that initiative was valued, that the family rewarded those who saw opportunities and seized them. He arrived in New York in May of 1837, just as a financial panic was sweeping across America, banks failing, businesses collapsing, a crisis that would lead to years of depression. A panic might seem like the worst possible time to establish a banking operation, but Belmont saw opportunity in the chaos. Many existing banks and merchants were in trouble. There was desperate need for access to credit and capital. particularly from European sources that weren't caught up in the American crisis. Belmont wrote to the Rothschilds explaining his situation and asking permission to establish himself as their agent in New York. They agreed. And so August Belmont and Company was born, not formally a Rothschild house, but closely tied to the family, operating on their behalf, channeling their capital into American investments. Belmont would handle transactions for the Rothschilds, would advise them on American opportunities, would serve as their eyes and ears in the New World. He would receive a commission on the business he generated, would build his own wealth while building theirs. Belmont assimilated into American society with remarkable speed. He anglicized his name. Schönberg, beautiful mountain, became Belmont, the French equivalent. He learned American business culture, which was different from European in subtle but important ways, more rough and tumble, less formal, more willing to take risks, less concerned with tradition and precedent. He made connections with American merchants and bankers and politicians, and within a few years he had established himself as a major figure in New York finance. He also became thoroughly American in his identity and loyalties. He married Caroline Perry, daughter of Commodore Matthew Perry and niece of Oliver Hazard Perry, American naval heroes from the War of 1812. This marriage brought him into the highest levels of American society, made him socially acceptable in ways that might have been difficult for a Jewish immigrant without such connections. He became involved in Democratic Party politics, eventually serving as chairman of the Democratic National Committee. He remained Jewish, but was accepted into circles where Jews often faced exclusion. Through Belmont, the Rothschilds financed American railways, invested in government bonds, facilitated trade finance. When the United States government needed to raise funds, particularly during the Civil War of 1861 to 1865, Belmont helped arrange European purchases of Union bonds. When American railways needed European capital, Belmont served as intermediary. The relationship was profitable for both parties. Belmont made a fortune, and the Rothschilds gained access to American opportunities without the risk and commitment of establishing their own house there. But why didn't they establish their own house? Why rely on an agent, however capable, rather than sending family members the way they had to Vienna and Naples and Paris? The answers are multiple and interconnected, and they tell us something about both the Rothschilds and America. First, distance. New York was weeks away from London by ship. Far more distant than any of the European capitals where the brothers had established themselves. Communication would be even slower and more difficult than between European cities. The kind of coordinated decision-making that made the Rothschild network so effective would be nearly impossible across the Atlantic. By the time a letter reached New York from London, circumstances might have changed entirely. The brother in New York would need to operate with enormous autonomy. More than was comfortable for a family that relied on close coordination. Second, culture. American business culture was different, more individualistic, more democratic in the lowercase sense. The deference to established banking houses, to old money, to aristocratic connections that characterized European finance didn't exist in America to nearly the same degree. A Rothschild in New York might find that the family name carried less weight than it did in Vienna or Paris. Americans judged you more on what you did than on who you were or who your grandfather had been. This wasn't universally true, of course. New York had its own aristocracy, its old Dutch families and its emerging class of merchant princes. But the social structure was more fluid, more open to disruption. Third, competition. American finance was developing its own institutions, its own dynasties. The House of Morgan was emerging as a dominant force. First under Junior Spencer Morgan in London, and then under his son John Pierpont Morgan in New York. The Morgans had their own connections to European capital, their own networks, their own ambitions. They weren't inclined to defer to the Rothschilds, or to let them dominate American finance the way they dominated European. Other American banking houses, Brown Brothers, Kuhn Loeb, Kidder Peabody, were also establishing themselves. The field was more crowded, more competitive. Fourth, perhaps most importantly, the American financial system was evolving in directions that didn't favour the Rothschild model. In Europe, a handful of great banking houses like the Rothschilds operated with privileged access to government finance, with close relationships to finance ministers and monarchs, with semi-official status that gave them advantages over competitors. America was deliberately moving away from this model. The destruction of the Second Bank of the United States reflected Andrew Jackson's hostility to concentrated financial power, his democratic populist conviction that banking should not be controlled by an elite. The American system was becoming more decentralized, more open, more competitive, characteristics that made it dynamic and innovative, but also less conducive to the kind of dominance the Rothschilds achieved in Europe. The Rothschilds adapted to this reality pragmatically. They would invest in America, would profit from American growth, but would do so primarily through agents and partnerships rather than direct presence. Belmont was the most important of these agents, but not the only one. They worked with the Morgans on various transactions. They invested through other banking houses when opportunities arose. They maintained flexibility rather than commitment, keeping their options open in a market they never quite understood, the way they understood European finance. American railways received substantial Rothschild investment, though often indirectly. The great transcontinental lines that would eventually span the continent, the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, the Northern Pacific, all required European capital, and some of that capital came through Rothschild channels. But the Rothschilds never dominated American railway finance the way James dominated French railways, or Salomon influenced Austrian lines. They were investors among many investors, important but not controlling. The Civil War presented both opportunity and risk. The war split America between Union North and Confederate South, and the financial markets had to decide which side would win. The Rothschilds, through Belmont and through their own analysis, generally supported the Union, believing that the North's industrial capacity and population would eventually prevail. They helped place Union bonds with European investors, providing crucial financing for the war effort. But they were careful, hedging their positions, avoiding the kind of all-in commitment they might have made to a European government they trusted and understood. After the war, during the Gilded Age of the late 1800s, American finance came into its own. J.P. Morgan emerged as the most powerful banker in America, arguably the most powerful banker in the world. Morgan's relationship with the Rothschilds was complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive, always characterized by mutual respect but also by clear understanding that Morgan was building his own empire and wouldn't be subordinate to anyone. When the United States needed to stabilize its gold reserves in the 1890s, it was Morgan who arranged the transaction, though he did work with the Rothschilds as partners rather than as their representative. The rise of American finance represented a shift in global economic power that the Rothschilds navigated but didn't control. Britain remained the world's financial centre through the 19th century, but America was clearly emerging as a rival. American banks, American capital markets, American entrepreneurial energy were becoming forces in their own right. The 20th century would see this shift accelerate, with New York eventually supplanting London as the world's financial capital. The Rothschilds would remain important, would maintain their positions in Europe, but they would never achieve in America what they had achieved in Europe. There's something almost poignant about this limitation. The family that had mastered European finance, that had built a network spanning a continent, that had financed empires and railways and industrialization, they couldn't quite replicate that success across the Atlantic. America was too different, too vast, too dynamic, too resistant to the kind of concentrated financial power they represented. August Belmont was successful, certainly, became wealthy and influential, but he was never the American equivalent of James in Paris or Nathan in London. He was an agent, a partner, a representative, but not a Rothschild, and that distinction mattered. The American story reminds us that the Rothschild success was specific to particular conditions, to European political structures, to the existence of monarchies and aristocracies they could integrate with, to financial systems that favoured established houses with government connections, to distances manageable with the communication technology of the era. When those conditions didn't exist, when the context was different, their model worked less well. They remained flexible enough to adapt, to find other ways to profit from American growth, but they never dominated. Let that thought settle, the limits of power, the recognition that even the most successful systems have boundaries, that what works in one context may not translate to another. The Rothschilds were masters of European finance, but America would chart its own course, would develop its own financial institutions, would eventually surpass Europe in economic power. The family participated in this transformation but didn't control it, profited from it but didn't define it. While the Rothschilds were navigating the complexities of American finance through agents and partnerships, while they were adapting to a world where their European dominance didn't automatically translate across the Atlantic, there was one moment in the 1870s that captured everything they had become: their speed, their access to capital, their intimate relationship with government power, their role in the great game of empires. This was the Suez Canal purchase of 1875, and it deserves our careful attention because it was perhaps the most dramatic single transaction in Rothschild history, a moment when private banking and state power fused in ways that shaped the course of imperial competition for decades to come. Let's set the scene carefully, because context matters here. By the 1870s, the map of the world was being recoloured by European imperial expansion. This was the age of the "ye must quote to," distinct from earlier colonial ventures by its scope and speed and systematic nature. Britain and France were competing for influence in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, the quote 3, was slowly fragmenting, and European powers were positioning themselves to inherit pieces of its territories. Egypt, nominally part of the Ottoman Empire but effectively autonomous under its Khedive, was particularly important in this competition. Egypt's importance had been magnified enormously by the completion of the Suez Canal in 1869. This engineering marvel, this 100-mile channel cut through desert and marshland connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, had transformed global trade. Ships could now travel from Europe to Asia without sailing around Africa, reducing journey times by thousands of miles, by weeks or even months of travel. The canal wasn't just convenient, it was strategic. Control of the canal meant control of the route to India, and India was the jewel of the British Empire, the source of enormous wealth and the anchor of Britain's global power. The canal had been built by a French company, the Suez Canal Company, under the direction of Ferdinand de Lesseps. The project had required enormous capital and labour. Thousands of workers, many of them Egyptian peasants forced into labour, had died during construction from disease and exhaustion. The Egyptian government, under Khedive Ismail, had been a major investor in the project, holding 44% of the company's shares. The rest were primarily held by French investors. Britain had been sceptical of the project initially, had declined to invest, had even opposed it diplomatically, fearing French influence in a region Britain considered vital to its interests. But once the canal opened and proved successful, British attitudes shifted. Ships of the Royal Navy and vessels of British Merchant Marine became the canal's heaviest users, accounting for roughly 80% of its traffic. Britain was benefiting enormously from a waterway it didn't control, and this made the Foreign Office and the Admiralty increasingly uncomfortable. They wanted ownership, or at least influence, over this vital artery of imperial communication. Meanwhile, Khedive Ismail was facing a financial crisis. Egypt had borrowed heavily to fund the canal construction and other modernization projects. The debt, much of it owed to European banks at high interest rates, had become unsustainable, The Khedive's revenues couldn't cover the interest payments, much less the principal. By 1875, he was desperate for cash, for any way to stave off bankruptcy and the European financial control that would follow. His most valuable asset was his shareholding in the Suez Canal Company, those shares that represented 44% of the company and paid substantial annual dividends. In November of 1875, word reached London that the Khedive was considering selling his shares. The potential buyers were a French syndicate, which made perfect sense. The canal company was French. Most of the existing shareholders were French. French investors would be natural purchasers. But if France acquired the Khedive's shares, France would control the canal completely, would have majority ownership, could potentially restrict British access or charge discriminatory fees. This was unacceptable from a British strategic perspective. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli saw the situation with characteristic clarity. Disraeli was a fascinating figure. Born Jewish, converted to Anglicanism as a child, a novelist before entering politics, flamboyant and imaginative and deeply committed to expanding British imperial power. He had been Prime Minister once before, briefly, in 1868. Now, in his second term beginning in 1874, he was determined to make his mark on foreign policy, to expand and consolidate the empire, to make Britain's dominance visible and undeniable. The canal shares represented exactly the kind of opportunity Disraeli loved. Dramatic, strategic, a chance to outmaneuver France. A move that would resonate both practically and symbolically. But there was a problem. Parliament was not in session. It had adjourned for the year and wouldn't reconvene until the new year. Without Parliament, there was no way to appropriate the funds needed to purchase the shares. The amount required was £4 million, an enormous sum, roughly equivalent to £300 million or more in modern terms. The government simply didn't have that kind of money sitting available to spend on the spur of the moment. This is where the story becomes both remarkable and revealing about the relationship between high finance and state power in the 19th century. Disraeli needed £4 million, needed it immediately before the French syndicate could finalise their own purchase, but had no legal authorisation to spend government money on this transaction. What he needed was someone who could lend the government £4 million on his word alone, who trusted that Parliament would eventually approve the purchase and appropriate the funds to repay the loan, who had that kind of capital readily available to deploy on short notice. He needed Lionel de Rothschild. Lionel was Nathan's son, now the head of the London Rothschild house. Having taken over after his father's death in 1855, he'd inherited not just his father's business, but his father's relationship with the British government, that intimate connection that made the Rothschilds the government's banker of first resort. Lionel was less flamboyant than Nathan had been, more reserved and careful, but just as shrewd and just as committed to maintaining the family's position at the centre of British finance. Lionel and Disraeli knew each other well. There was a personal connection beyond business. Both were of Jewish origin, though their paths from those origins had been very different. Disraeli had converted, had become Prime Minister, had reached the absolute pinnacle of political power in a Christian nation. Lionel had remained Jewish, had fought for 11 years to take his seat in Parliament, represented a different path to acceptance and influence. They respected each other, understood each other, could speak directly without the elaborate diplomatic courtesies that might slow negotiations. The exact details of their meeting have been embellished over the years, turned into legend. But the essence is well documented. On November 23, 1875, Disraeli's private secretary went to the Rothschild office in New Court. The message was simple. The Prime Minister needed £4 million, needed it by the next day, needed it to purchase the Khedive's canal shares. Could Lionel provide it? This required a decision of enormous magnitude. £4 million was a vast sum even for the Rothschilds. If something went wrong, if Parliament refused to approve the purchase, if the transaction fell through, If the government couldn't or wouldn't repay, the loss would be substantial, but the opportunity was also clear. This was exactly the kind of transaction the Rothschilds specialised in: facilitating government action, making state power possible through private capital, earning fees and gratitude and influence that would last far beyond the immediate transaction. Lionel's response, according to the story that has come down to us, was magnificently understated. When asked if he could provide £4 million immediately, he supposedly paused, ate a grape — he was having lunch when the secretary arrived — and said simply, "Yes." No elaborate negotiations, no lengthy discussions of terms, just yes. The capital would be available. The actual mechanics were more complex than this anecdote suggests, of course. The Rothschilds didn't have £4 million sitting in cash in their vaults, but they had the creditworthiness, the reputation, the connections to mobilise that amount quickly. They could call in funds from various investments, could borrow against their own assets, could issue their own notes that would be accepted as good as gold because everyone knew the Rothschild name stood behind them. What they really had was trust. The trust that their word was good, that they could deliver what they promised, that their financial position was so solid that £4 million, while substantial, was manageable. The terms were straightforward. The Rothschilds would lend the British government £4 million. The government would use these funds to purchase the Khedive's shares. When Parliament reconvened and approved the purchase, the government would repay the loan plus interest. The interest rate was, by some accounts, 5%, high by government borrowing standards but reasonable for such a large sum advanced so quickly, with minimal security beyond the Prime Minister's word that Parliament would approve. The transaction moved forward with remarkable speed. By November 24th, the day after Disraeli's secretary visited Lionel, the British agent in Cairo was negotiating with the Khedive. By November 25th, the deal was essentially complete. The Khedive would receive just under £4 million, £3,976,582 to be precise, in exchange for his shareholding in the Suez Canal Company. The Rothschilds advanced the funds. The shares were transferred. Britain had achieved, in less than 3 days, a strategic acquisition that would shape imperial competition for decades. Parliament, when it reconvened, debated the purchase vigorously. Opposition members questioned whether it was wise, whether the price was too high, whether Disraeli had exceeded his authority in committing government funds without parliamentary approval. But the purchase was popular with the public, was seen as a bold stroke that enhanced British prestige and security. Parliament ultimately approved, the Rothschilds were repaid with interest, and the shares became a valuable government asset, paying dividends that more than covered the purchase price over the following years. The significance of the Suez transaction extended far beyond the immediate financial details. It demonstrated several things simultaneously about how power worked in the late 19th century. First, it showed the speed advantage that private capital could provide. Governments, bound by laws and procedures and parliamentary oversight, couldn't always move quickly. Banks, particularly banks like the Rothschilds with enormous capital and concentrated decision-making, could. This made them indispensable partners in situations requiring rapid action. Second, it revealed the intimacy between financial and political power at the highest levels. Disraeli could call on Lionel for £4 million on a day's notice because they had a relationship built over years, built on previous transactions, built on mutual trust and understanding of each other's interests. This wasn't corruption exactly. Disraeli wasn't personally profiting, and Lionel was lending at market rates. But it was a form of power concentration that gave a small number of people enormous influence over events that would affect millions. Third, the transaction showed how private capital enabled imperial expansion. Britain acquired its stake in the Suez Canal not through military conquest, not through diplomatic manoeuvring alone, but through a financial transaction. Money was power. Perhaps the most effective form of power because it seemed so much less violent than military force, so much more legitimate than naked coercion. The Egyptians weren't invaded, they were bought out. The result in terms of British control was similar, but the means were different. The Suez Purchase became one of the signature achievements of Disraeli's second ministry, mentioned in his speeches, celebrated in newspaper cartoons showing him presenting the canal to Queen Victoria, remembered as evidence of his bold imperial vision. And the Rothschilds were central to this achievement, not visibly. Most people didn't know the details of how the transaction was financed, but crucially. Without Lionel's willingness to advance the funds immediately, the opportunity would have been lost. The French would have purchased the shares. British strategic interests would have suffered. For the Rothschild family, the Suez transaction reinforced their position as the British government's most important financial partner. It brought fees and interest, certainly, but more importantly, it brought gratitude and future business. When the government needed financial services in subsequent years, the Rothschilds would be remembered as the bank that had made the canal purchase possible. Relationships like this, built on crucial moments when private capital made state action possible, were the foundation of the Rothschild business model. But there's something else worth considering here, something about the nature of the transaction and what it meant for Egypt. The Khedive sold his shares because he was desperate, because European banks had lent him money at terms he couldn't sustain, because his government's finances had been compromised by debt and by the costly modernization projects that debt had funded. The canal itself, while a remarkable engineering achievement, had been built partly with forced labour, had cost Egyptian lives and resources, and now, when the canal was finally profitable, when those shares were finally valuable, Egypt's sovereign was forced to sell them to cover debts to European creditors. This pattern, European capital financing development projects in non-European countries, those countries falling into debt, then losing control of their own assets and infrastructure to their creditors, was repeated across the colonial and semi-colonial world in the 19th century. It was imperialism through finance rather than force, though force was always available as backup when financial leverage proved insufficient. Egypt would eventually fall under British control, becoming a protectorate, its government supervised by British advisors who ensured that Egyptian revenues were used to service European debts. The Suez Purchase was an early step in this process of absorption. The Rothschilds weren't responsible for imperialism. Those structures and ambitions existed independent of any single banking family. But they were participants, facilitators, beneficiaries. They made imperialism easier, more efficient, more financially rational. When we consider their role, we need to hold both truths, that they were brilliant financiers who built something remarkable, and that what they built served purposes that we might now view as problematic at best, deeply unjust at worst. History is like that, rarely offering simple moral clarity, usually demanding that we acknowledge complexity and contradiction. The Suez transaction was the last of the truly dramatic Rothschild moments, the last time a single lightning-fast financial move would capture public imagination and shape imperial history. The world was changing. Capital markets were becoming larger, more institutionalized, less dependent on any single banking family. The Rothschilds would remain important, would continue to thrive, but they would never again have quite the same concentrated influence, quite the same ability to make history with a single loan. Disraeli and Lionel, meeting in 1875 to arrange £4 million in an afternoon, represented the peak of a particular form of power. Private banking enabling state action, personal relationships facilitating imperial expansion, capital and politics fusing seamlessly at the highest levels. That world was already beginning to fade, but in that moment, in that transaction, it achieved perhaps its purest expression. Let that settle, the image of prime minister and banker, of state and capital, working together to acquire a canal that would shape global trade for over a century, all arranged in less time than it now takes to process a mortgage application. As the Rothschilds moved through the late 19th century, as they continued their banking operations and maintained their positions in European finance, there was another story developing alongside their actual history, a shadow narrative that we need to address directly and carefully. This is the story of how their success made them targets, how their visibility attracted not just admiration but suspicion and hostility, how myths and conspiracy theories attached themselves to the family name and spread in ways that would have consequences far beyond business or finance. This is uncomfortable territory, but it's essential to understanding the complete Rothschild story. So let's proceed thoughtfully. Success, particularly financial success achieved by members of a minority group, has always attracted a certain kind of hostile attention. This is a pattern that repeats across cultures and centuries. When people who are supposed to be subordinate or marginal achieve wealth and influence, it creates cognitive dissonance in societies built on hierarchy and exclusion. The explanation that such people might simply be talented or hard-working or fortunate doesn't satisfy those who need to believe in a natural order where certain groups belong at the bottom. So other explanations emerge, darker explanations that attribute success to deception or manipulation or conspiracy. For Jews in Christian Europe, this pattern was ancient and deeply embedded. Medieval Christianity had positioned Jews as simultaneously necessary. Someone had to lend money, since the church forbade Christians from charging interest, and dangerous carriers of religious pollution, killers of Christ, fundamentally alien to Christian society. These theological foundations created a framework where Jewish success in finance, rather than being seen as the natural result of being pushed into one of the few occupations available, was instead interpreted as evidence of sinister intent. The Rothschild family, by becoming so spectacularly successful, by achieving wealth and influence that surpassed even ancient Christian banking houses, became a focal point for these ancient prejudices expressed in modern form. They weren't just successful Jews, they were the most successful Jews, the most visible, the most obviously powerful. And their success coincided with a period of rapid social change in Europe that made many people anxious and afraid. The Industrial Revolution was transforming traditional ways of life. Old certainties about social hierarchy were eroding. The modern world was emerging, and it felt threatening to those who had been comfortable in the old order. When people feel anxious and disoriented, they look for explanations, for someone to blame. The Rothschilds, wealthy and Jewish and internationally connected, were convenient targets. If you were an aristocrat watching your ancestral estates become economically obsolete, watching industrial wealth eclipse agricultural wealth, it was comforting to believe that this transformation wasn't natural evolution, but rather the result of Jewish manipulation. If you were a worker suffering in factories, facing unemployment or wage cuts, it was simpler to blame Jewish bankers than to grapple with the complex economic forces actually shaping your life. If you were threatened by liberalism, by democracy, by modernization, you could attribute all these changes to a Jewish conspiracy, rather than to impersonal historical forces. The theories that emerged were remarkably consistent across different countries and contexts, which tells us they were drawing on shared cultural templates, rather than responding to actual Rothschild behavior. The basic narrative went something like this. The Rothschilds, through their international network and their wealth, secretly controlled European governments. They started wars or prevented peace according to their financial interests. They manipulated currencies and markets to enrich themselves at others' expense. They were working towards some ultimate goal, sometimes portrayed as world domination, sometimes as the destruction of Christian civilization, sometimes as both. These theories were nonsense, let's be absolutely clear about that. The Rothschilds were influential, yes, wealthy, yes, well-connected, certainly. But they didn't control governments, couldn't start or stop wars at will, didn't manipulate global events according to some master plan. They were bankers who worked within existing power structures, who responded to opportunities created by forces much larger than themselves, who succeeded partly through skill and partly through fortunate timing and partly through the same mix of factors that explains most success stories. But conspiracy theories aren't really about evidence or logic. They're about narrative, about providing simple explanations for complex phenomena, about identifying enemies who can be blamed for everything wrong with the world. The Rothschilds, because of their visibility and their Jewish identity, fit the role that conspiracy theorists needed someone to fill. The spread of these theories accelerated in the late 19th century for several reasons. First, this was the period when modern anti-Semitism was taking shape. Distinct from the older religious forms, this new anti-Semitism presented itself as scientific, as based on race rather than religion. It claimed that Jews were fundamentally different from and dangerous to European peoples, that this difference was biological and unchangeable. Conversion didn't matter in this framework. A Jew remained a Jew regardless of religious belief. This made the Rothschilds particularly useful as symbols, because they had achieved social integration while remaining identifiably Jewish. Second, this was a period of expanding literacy and print media. Newspapers, pamphlets, cheap books could now reach mass audiences. Conspiracy theories that might once have circulated only in limited circles could now spread widely and rapidly. Anti-Semitic publishers found a market for their material, particularly in France and Germany, where economic anxiety and political instability created receptive audiences. Third, and this is crucial, conspiracy theories about the Rothschilds provided a language for discussing economic forces that were becoming increasingly abstract and difficult to understand. Finance was becoming more complex, more divorced from tangible things like land or goods. Gold standards, exchange rates, government bonds, stock markets, these were mysterious to most people, and mystery breeds suspicion. If you couldn't understand how finance worked, it was tempting to believe it was a trick, a deception, a conspiracy. One of the most notorious and consequential pieces of anti-Semitic propaganda emerged in Russia in the early 1900s, a fraudulent text called quote. This document, supposedly the minutes of a secret meeting of Jewish leaders planning world domination, was a fabrication. Plagiarized partly from an 1865 French political satire that had nothing to do with Jews, but it was presented as authentic, as evidence of an actual Jewish conspiracy. The Rothschilds featured prominently in the interpretations and extensions of this text, portrayed as the financial arm of this supposed conspiracy. The protocols would be exposed as a forgery repeatedly. Journalists and scholars demonstrated beyond any doubt that it was fake, but exposure didn't stop its spread. It was translated into multiple languages. It was cited by anti-Semites across Europe and eventually in America and the Middle East. It influenced Nazi ideology. It continues to circulate today in certain circles, still believed despite all evidence to the contrary. This tells us something important about conspiracy theories. They're not really about evidence. They persist because they serve psychological and political purposes, because people want to believe them, because they provide simple answers to complex questions. The Rothschild family's actual response to these attacks was limited. They couldn't stop people from believing absurd things about them. Engaging directly with conspiracy theories often backfires, making the theories seem more important, giving them publicity they don't deserve. The family generally chose to ignore the attacks, to continue their business, to rely on their actual relationships and actual reputation among people who mattered. Government officials, business partners, fellow bankers who knew from direct experience that the conspiracy theories were false. But ignoring attacks doesn't make them harmless. The conspiracy theories created an atmosphere where anti-Semitism was normalized, where it became acceptable to speak of Jews, and particularly wealthy Jews like the Rothschilds, as dangerous, as enemies of society. This atmosphere would have terrible consequences in the 20th century, but even in the late 19th century, it made life more precarious for Jews across Europe. including those far less privileged than the Rothschilds. There's a bitter irony here worth noting. The Rothschilds had achieved what was supposed to be the path to acceptance: economic success, social integration, contributions to culture and charity, service to European states. They had received noble titles, had built palaces, had intermarried with aristocracy, had proven themselves loyal citizens of their respective countries. And yet none of this protected them from being cast as alien conspirators, as threats to the very societies they had integrated into. This suggests something about the limits of integration when prejudice runs deep enough, when the categories of belonging are defined in ways that permanently exclude certain groups. The family continued their philanthropy, their support of Jewish causes and communities, their quiet behind-the-scenes work to help Jews facing persecution. When Jews were expelled from Russia, when pogroms destroyed communities, when refugees needed help, Rothschild money often helped fund relief efforts and resettlement. They used their influence when they could to advocate for Jewish rights, though always carefully, aware that too visible advocacy might confirm suspicions about Jewish solidarity and international coordination. But their very success, their very visibility, made them symbols that could be weaponized against Jews generally. Anti-Semites would point to the Rothschilds and say, "See, this is what Jews are really like, wealthy manipulators who control governments." The fact that the Rothschilds were exceptional, that the vast majority of Jews were poor or working class, that Jewish communities in Eastern Europe were suffering terrible poverty and persecution, none of this mattered to the conspiracy theorists. The Rothschilds became the prototype, the example that supposedly revealed Jewish nature and Jewish ambitions. This scapegoating intensified during periods of crisis, economic depressions, political upheavals, military defeats. Whenever things went wrong, conspiracy theories offered explanations that directed blame toward convenient targets. The crash of 1873, which led to a long depression across Europe, sparked anti-Semitic agitation that blamed Jewish financiers. Nationalist movements in various European countries incorporated anti-Semitism into their ideologies, portraying Jews as fundamentally foreign, as obstacles to national unity and strength. It's important to understand that these conspiracy theories weren't just bizarre beliefs held by marginal extremists. They circulated among educated people, among political leaders, among those who considered themselves sophisticated and modern. Antisemitism was woven into European culture so thoroughly that many people absorbed its assumptions without even recognizing them as prejudice. The idea that Jews were fundamentally different, potentially dangerous, needed to be watched. This was mainstream enough that even people who would have rejected violent antisemitism might still harbour these subtler biases. The Rothschild experience reveals something about how prejudice operates at different levels of society. At the highest levels, among political and financial elites who work directly with the family, there might be respect, even friendship, certainly recognition of their competence and importance. But this didn't prevent these same elites from harbouring or tolerating anti-Semitic attitudes more generally. They might make exceptions for the Rothschilds, quote 6, quote 7, quote 8, while still maintaining prejudices against Jews as a group. And at popular levels, among people who never interacted with any Rothschild, who knew the name only from newspapers and pamphlets and stories, the family became entirely symbolic. Characters in a narrative that had little connection to reality. The actual Rothschilds, complex individuals with various personalities and priorities, families with children and marriages and ordinary human concerns, disappeared behind the myth. They became cartoons, evil bankers in political illustrations, names invoked to explain anything wrong with modern life. This process of turning real people into symbols, into abstractions that can be hated without complexity or empathy, is how prejudice dehumanizes. It's easier to hate the Rothschilds when you think of them as the Rothschilds, a unified malevolent entity, rather than as several branches of a family with different individuals who might disagree with each other, who had their own doubts and failures and ordinary human concerns. The conspiracy theories required the Rothschilds to be something they weren't, perfectly unified, all-knowing, all-controlling, because the actual Rothschilds, talented but fallible bankers working within constraints, couldn't serve the narrative function the conspiracy theorists needed. As we move toward the 20th century, these conspiracy theories would become more dangerous, would be incorporated into ideologies that led to violence and eventually to genocide. But in the late 19th century, they were already creating an atmosphere of suspicion and hostility, already making it clear that success and integration wouldn't protect Jews from being cast as perpetual outsiders, already preparing the groundwork for what would come. The Rothschild story, therefore, isn't just a story of financial innovation and success. It's also a story about the limits of that success, about how achievement can make you a target, about how prejudice adapts and persists even when its original forms have been discredited. The family had built something remarkable, had changed how international finance worked, had integrated themselves into European aristocracy and government. But they remained vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with their actual behaviour and everything to do with ancient prejudices expressed in modern forms. Let that awareness settle, the recognition that success doesn't always bring security, that visibility can be a liability, that the stories others tell about you can be more powerful than the truth of who you actually are. The conspiracy theories, the myths, the shadow narrative that had grown around the Rothschild name through the late 19th century, these remained largely in the realm of ideas, of prejudice expressed through words and images and social exclusion. But as Europe moved into the 20th century, as the relative peace that had prevailed since Waterloo began to fracture, those ideas would encounter forces that would give them terrible physical reality. We need to approach this part of the story with care, with recognition that we're moving from the history of banking into the history of catastrophe, from the story of a family's rise to the story of how that family experienced the worst that the 20th century could inflict. The world that the Rothschilds had mastered, that system of interlocking European monarchies and relatively stable borders and financial networks that crossed national boundaries with relative ease, this world ended in the summer of 1914. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered a cascade of mobilizations and declarations of war that transformed Europe into a charnel house with stunning speed. Within weeks, the great powers were locked in combat. Within months, trenches stretched across France and Belgium, and armies were dying by the hundreds of thousands in artillery barrages and futile assaults. For the Rothschild family, the First World War was a particular kind of nightmare. Their network, their greatest strength, was suddenly a liability. The five-city system that Mayor Amschel had envisioned, that had worked so brilliantly when Europe was at peace, or when conflicts were limited, this system couldn't function when Europe was divided into armed camps, when brother nations became mortal enemies. The London Rothschilds were British, subjects of King George, citizens of a nation at war with Germany and Austria. The Paris Rothschilds were French, citizens of the French Republic that had mobilized its armies against Germany. The Vienna Rothschilds were Austrian, subjects of the Habsburg Emperor Franz Joseph, whose empire was fighting against France and Britain and Russia. The Frankfurt Rothschilds were German, citizens of the Kaiser's Reich. Only Naples was neutral, and the Naples branch had already declined in importance, would eventually close entirely. Imagine the impossible position this created. Brothers and cousins on opposite sides of a war. Family members whose nations were trying to destroy each other. The Rothschilds in London were helping finance the British war effort, floating loans, facilitating payments to allies. The Rothschilds in Vienna and Frankfurt were doing the same for the Central Powers. The coordination that had been their greatest advantage was impossible. The trust that had made their network function was strained by the simple fact that they couldn't communicate freely. Letters between enemy nations would be intercepted, information couldn't flow, the system broke down. More than that, each branch faced suspicion from their own government. The British Rothschilds were suspected by some of maintaining sympathies with their German cousins of being potential traitors because of family connections. The Austrian and German Rothschilds faced similar suspicions in reverse. The fact that they were Jewish added another layer of suspicion. Anti-Semites in every country claimed that Jews were fundamentally disloyal, that they maintained international solidarity that trumped national allegiance. The Rothschilds, with their literal international family connections, seemed to confirm these prejudices. The war itself was horror beyond anything Europe had experienced before. The trenches, the gas attacks, the artillery barrages that went on for days, the millions of young men fed into battles that gained a few hundred yards at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. This industrial slaughter made the Napoleonic Wars look almost quaint by comparison. And when it finally ended in November 1918, when the guns fell silent after more than 4 years, the map of Europe had been redrawn more completely than at any time since Napoleon's defeat. 4 empires had collapsed. The Russian Empire fell to revolution in 1917, replaced by the Soviet Union under communist rule. The German Kaiser abdicated, replaced by the Weimar Republic. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved entirely into successor states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, parts absorbed by Poland and Romania and Italy. The Ottoman Empire was dismembered, its territories divided among the victors. The world the Rothschilds had operated in, built around those empires and their relatively stable borders, simply no longer existed. The family's relative position had also changed. They remained wealthy, certainly, remained influential in certain spheres. But they were no longer the dominant force in international finance that they had been before the war. The war had created enormous government debts, but it had also created new institutions and new banking houses to handle those debts. The United States had emerged from the war as the world's largest creditor nation, and American banks were now major players in international finance. J.P. Morgan and Company had eclipsed the Rothschilds in importance for many transactions. The interwar period, those 20 years between the wars from 1918 to 1939, was turbulent and anxious. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war, imposed harsh terms on Germany, including massive reparations that Germany struggled to pay. The German economy collapsed into hyperinflation in the early 1920s, destroying savings and creating conditions of desperation and resentment. Economic crisis spread. The Great Depression, which began with the American stock market crash in 1929, devastated economies worldwide. Political extremism flourished in this chaos. Communist parties gained strength, particularly in areas where poverty was most acute. But more ominously for Jews in general and the Rothschilds in particular, fascist movements emerged across Europe, bringing anti-Semitism from the margins into mainstream politics. In Italy, Benito Mussolini took power in 1922. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party grew from a marginal extremist movement in the early 20s into the dominant political force by the early 30s. Hitler's ideology was built on anti-Semitism of the most virulent kind. He blamed Jews for Germany's defeat in World War I, for the Versailles Treaty's harsh terms, for the economic chaos of the Weimar years, for communism, for capitalism, for modernity itself. The Nazis portrayed Jews as simultaneously Bolshevik revolutionaries and capitalist exploiters, as racially inferior yet somehow controlling superior Aryan peoples. These contradictions didn't matter. Nazi ideology wasn't about logical consistency, but about identifying an enemy who could be blamed for everything and ultimately eliminated. The Rothschilds featured prominently in Nazi propaganda, exactly as they had in 19th century conspiracy theories. They were portrayed as the epitome of Jewish financial manipulation, as puppet masters controlling governments, as parasites feeding on Aryan labour. Nazi publications recycled and amplified all the old conspiracy theories, presenting them as historical fact, as evidence that justified eliminating Jewish influence from German life. When Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, Jewish life in Germany became increasingly precarious. Discriminatory laws were passed, excluding Jews from professions, from government employment, from universities. Jewish businesses were boycotted, vandalized, eventually confiscated. Jews were stripped of citizenship rights, forbidden to marry non-Jews, subjected to escalating violence and humiliation. The goal was to make Germany, quote, free of Jews, either by forcing emigration or eventually by something much worse. The Austrian Rothschilds, headquartered in Vienna, watched these developments with growing alarm. Austria itself had a substantial anti-Semitic movement, though the country remained independent through most of the 1930s. But in March 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria in the Kansas, quote, 10, and overnight, Austrian Jews came under Nazi control. The Vienna Rothschild Bank, one of the 5 original branches, was seized. The family's art collections, their palaces, their assets, everything in Austria was confiscated by the Nazi regime. Baron Louis de Rothschild, head of the Vienna branch, was arrested and held for ransom. The Nazis demanded an enormous payment for his release, the largest ransom payment in history to that point. After complex negotiations involving family members in other countries and various intermediaries, after more than a year in captivity, Louis was finally released in May 1939. He fled Austria, leaving behind everything the family had built there over more than a century. Other family members escaped Austria and Germany when they could, recognizing that remaining meant imprisonment or worse. They abandoned homes, businesses, art collections, lives they had built over generations. Some made it to Britain, to France, to America. They were fortunate. They had the resources and connections to escape. Most European Jews didn't have those advantages, couldn't get visas, couldn't afford to leave, and would face what came next with no way out. What came next was the Second World War, which began in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, and with the war came the Holocaust. We need to proceed very carefully here, with deep respect for those who suffered and died, with recognition that what we're discussing transcends banking history and enters into the darkest chapter of human cruelty. The Nazi regime, having conquered most of Europe by 1941, implemented what they called the final solution, the systematic murder of all European Jews. This wasn't spontaneous violence or pogroms, though there was plenty of that too. This was industrialized genocide, death factories, gas chambers, murder on a scale and with an organization that still defies comprehension. 6 million Jews were killed. 6 million individual human beings, each with their own story, each with families and hopes and lives that were extinguished. Some Rothschild family members were among those murdered, not the famous banking branches, most of whom had the resources to escape, though even for them escape was difficult and traumatic and meant abandoning everything. But extended family members, more distant relatives who lacked the wealth and connections that could have saved them, Jewish families who happened to bear the Rothschild name or were connected to the family by marriage. Some of these people died in the camps. We honour their memory, acknowledge their loss, recognise that they were caught in a catastrophe that made no distinction between wealthy and poor, between famous and obscure, that sought to eliminate Jews entirely regardless of their individual circumstances. The family's assets across occupied Europe were systematically looted. The Nazi regime seized the Vienna branch's holdings. The Frankfurt branch's assets were confiscated. The Paris branch was taken over after France fell in 1940. The art collections that had been built over generations, the libraries and manuscripts, the palaces and estates, much of this was stolen by Nazi officials for their own collections or was destroyed. Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command, personally looted Rothschild art collections, selecting pieces for his private collection. Only the London branch remained fully operational, now truly the centre of the family's operations. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany after France's fall in June 1940, enduring the Blitz, the sustained bombing campaign that tried to break British will. The British Rothschilds supported the war effort financially, helped refugees when possible, maintained operations under extremely difficult circumstances. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, when the tide slowly began to turn against Nazi Germany, the family waited and hoped and did what they could. The war ended in Europe in May 1945 with Germany's surrender. The full scope of the Holocaust became clear as Allied armies liberated the death camps, found the survivors, those skeletal figures who had endured the unendurable, who had survived against all odds. The world recoiled in horror at what had been done, though that horror came too late for those who had already died. For the Rothschild family, the post-war period required rebuilding from catastrophic losses. Not just financial losses, though those were substantial, but the loss of family members, the destruction of communities they had been part of, the obliteration of the world they had known. The Vienna branch essentially ceased to exist as a major operation. The family would eventually establish a small presence there again, but nothing like the great house that Salomon had founded. The Frankfurt branch never recovered its pre-war position. The Paris branch would be rebuilt, but it took years. The distribution of power in international finance had shifted permanently. The United States was now the dominant economic power. New York had eclipsed London as the world's financial centre. American banks like J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs were handling transactions that once would have gone to the Rothschilds. The family remained wealthy, remained important in certain spheres, but their position had changed fundamentally. They were no longer the preeminent banking dynasty. No longer the first name that came to mind when governments needed major financing. There was also a psychological transformation. The confidence that had characterized the family in the 19th century, the sense of security that came from success and integration, had been shattered. They had learned, in the most terrible way possible, that success didn't protect you, that integration was conditional, that the society that had accepted them could turn on them with murderous intent. This knowledge would shape how the family operated going forward, would influence their choices about visibility and risk, would remain a permanent scar on their collective memory. The lesson of the world wars, for the Rothschilds and for Jews more broadly, was that the categories of citizenship and belonging that seemed stable could collapse with terrifying speed. The Austrian and German Rothschilds had been noble, had been wealthy, had been pillars of their communities, and none of that protected them when the regime changed. The idea that achievement and integration would lead to acceptance, that success would bring security, this idea had been tested and found tragically false. Yet the family survived. Not intact, not unchanged, not without terrible losses, but survived. They rebuilt what they could, adapted to changed circumstances, continued their operations in a world that was fundamentally different from the one they had known. This resilience, this refusal to simply disappear despite everything, was itself a form of resistance, a determination that the forces that had tried to destroy them would not have the final victory. The Rothschild story continued beyond the Holocaust, though it continued in a different register, with different aspirations, in a world that would never again feel as secure or as promising as it had once seemed. The world that emerged from the ashes of the Second World War was almost unrecognisably different from the one the Rothschilds had dominated in the 19th century. The British Empire, which had seemed eternal, was dissolving as colonies gained independence. European powers that had ruled much of the globe were now exhausted, bankrupt, rebuilding their own devastated countries. The United States and the Soviet Union faced each other across what Winston Churchill called an Iron Curtain, dividing Europe into spheres of influence, beginning a Cold War that would define global politics for the next 4 decades. International finance had been transformed. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944, created new institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, to manage global economic affairs. The dollar, backed by American gold reserves, became the world's reserve currency. Capital markets that had once centered on London were now increasingly oriented toward New York. The intimate relationships between private banking houses and European governments, relationships that had been the foundation of Rothschild power, were being replaced by more institutional bureaucratic arrangements in this changed world. The Rothschild family faced a choice. They could try to maintain their traditional model, private family banks operating on the basis of personal relationships and reputation, or they could adapt, modernize, transform themselves into something more suited to the corporate structures that were coming to dominate finance. Different branches made different choices, moved at different speeds, but the overall trajectory was toward adaptation, toward accepting that the old world couldn't be restored. The London branch, N.M. Rothschild and Sons, had survived the war intact and remained the family's strongest operation. In the post-war years, it focused increasingly on corporate advisory work, helping companies with mergers and acquisitions, arranging financing for major transactions, providing strategic advice. This was a different kind of banking than the government bond underwriting and bullion trading that had made Nathan's fortune. It required different skills, different relationships, different ways of operating. But it was profitable and sustainable in the new environment. The firm remained private, family-controlled, which gave it certain advantages. It didn't have to answer to public shareholders, didn't have to prioritize short-term profits over long-term relationships, could take a more patient approach to building its business. But being private also meant it was smaller than the great public banks that were emerging, banks that could raise capital from markets and use that capital to expand into new areas, to compete more aggressively for business. The Paris branch, de Rothschild Frères, had to be entirely rebuilt. The offices had been confiscated during the occupation, records lost or destroyed, assets seized. The family returned after liberation and began again, drawing on relationships that had survived the war, reconnecting with clients, re-establishing themselves in French finance. Guy de Rothschild, who would lead the Paris bank for much of the post-war period, wrote in his memoirs about the surreal experience of walking back into the family's former offices and having to prove they had a right to be there. The Paris house focused on similar business to London: corporate finance, advisory work, private banking for wealthy clients. But it operated in a more difficult political environment. France had a strong tradition of state involvement in the economy, nationalised industries, suspicion of private capital. The Rothschilds had to navigate carefully, maintain their business while avoiding the political targeting that had made them vulnerable in the past. In 1982, the newly elected socialist government under François Mitterrand nationalised the French banking sector, including Bank Rothschild. This wasn't specifically aimed at the Rothschilds, it was part of a broader socialist programme, but it effectively ended the Paris branch's operations as a family bank. The family received compensation, but their bank became state property. It was a strange echo of the war, not violent, not motivated by anti-Semitism, but still a loss of the institution that James had founded over a century and a half earlier. Guy de Rothschild's response was characteristic of the family's adaptability. If they couldn't operate a bank in France under that name, they would create something new. In 1983, he established Rothschild et Compagnie Banque, a new investment bank. When the socialists left power and the banking sector was privatized again in the 1990s, the family was positioned to expand once more. The Paris Rothschild operation exists today, though in forms that would be almost unrecognizable to James. The Vienna branch never fully recovered. Louis de Rothschild, who had been held for ransom and had barely escaped with his life, never returned to live in Austria. The palaces were eventually reclaimed or compensated for after lengthy legal proceedings, but the banking house itself was not revived in any significant form. Vienna, once one of the 5 great Rothschild centres, became merely a historical footnote, a reminder of what had been lost. As the 20th century progressed, as the family moved through the 1960s and 70s and 80s, they faced increasing pressure to modernise, to merge, to consolidate operations in ways that made sense for contemporary finance. the various Rothschild banks began to coordinate more closely, eventually merging operations to create larger, more competitive entities. In 2003, the French and British operations merged to create Rothschild Continuation Holdings, later renamed Rothschild and Company, or Rothschild et Cie. This modern entity is publicly traded. You can buy shares in it on the stock exchange, though the family maintains majority control. It's a far cry from the purely private family banks of the 19th century. The company employs thousands of people, operates offices in dozens of countries, provides services that range from mergers and acquisitions advisory to wealth management to restructuring advice for troubled companies. It's a successful business by modern standards, well respected in certain niches, but it doesn't dominate its industry the way the 19th century Rothschilds dominated theirs. The scale has changed. In the 19th century, the Rothschilds were often the largest source of capital available for major projects or government loans. Today, capital markets are vastly larger and more liquid. A government or corporation needing to raise money has numerous options: investment banks, commercial banks, bond markets, stock markets. The Rothschilds are one option among many, competing for business rather than being the default choice. The nature of banking itself has changed. Modern finance is less about personal relationships and reputation, more about quantitative analysis and risk models and regulatory compliance. The intimate connections between bankers and government ministers that characterized the 19th century would now be seen as conflicts of interest or potential corruption. Banking has been institutionalized, bureaucratized, made more transparent but also more impersonal. The Rothschilds adapted to all of this, but adaptation meant accepting diminished relative importance. They remained wealthy. The family collectively is worth billions of dollars, though estimates vary and the fortune is spread across many family members rather than concentrated as it once was. They remained influential in certain spheres, particularly in Europe, but they weren't titans bestriding the financial world the way Nathan and James had been. Part of the family's story in the late 20th and early 21st centuries moved away from banking entirely. The wine estates became increasingly important, both economically and symbolically. The Rothschilds had been investing in wine production since the 19th century. In 1868, Nathaniel de Rothschild had purchased Chateau Mouton Rothschild in Bordeaux. His cousin James had acquired Chateau Lafite. These estates produced some of the world's finest wines. Premier Cru classified growths that commanded premium prices. Wine became a way for the family to maintain prestige and visibility in a sphere less fraught than banking. You couldn't have conspiracy theories about wine the way you could about finance. Wine was culture, agriculture, tradition, craft. The Rothschild wines were celebrated not because of the family name exactly, though that didn't hurt, but because they were genuinely excellent. Baron Philippe de Rothschild, who managed Mouton for much of the 20th century, was a genuine character, a poet and filmmaker, and racing enthusiast who brought creativity and energy to wine production. The estates expanded beyond France. The family established operations in California, in Chile, in South Africa, partnering with local winemakers, bringing Rothschild expertise and branding to new regions. These weren't vanity projects. They were serious businesses, profitable operations that employed hundreds of people and produced millions of bottles annually. But they represented a different kind of Rothschild enterprise, one less connected to the high-stakes world of international finance. The family also maintained significant philanthropic and cultural activities. They funded museums, supported scientific research, preserved historical buildings and collections. The Rothschild Foundation in Britain supports arts and heritage projects. In France, family members have been involved in various charitable endeavours. In Israel, the family has funded numerous institutions, from the Knesset building to research institutes to hospitals. This philanthropy served multiple purposes: genuine desire to contribute to society, maintenance of the family's reputation and legacy, continuation of traditions of Jewish communal responsibility that went back to the Frankfurt ghetto. Individual family members pursued various careers, not all connected to the family businesses. Some remained in banking and finance, rising to leadership positions in Rothschild operations. Others became scientists, artists, politicians, environmentalists. The family had grown large enough, wealthy enough, that not everyone needed to work in the family firm. They could pursue their own interests while maintaining connection to the family name and legacy. What does it mean to be a Rothschild today? It means carrying a name that remains famous, that still appears in financial news when the family firms are involved in major transactions, that carries historical weight but perhaps less contemporary power than many imagine. It means being heirs to an extraordinary story but living in a world where that story's direct relevance has diminished. The skills that made the 19th century Rothschilds dominant, the ability to move capital across borders, to coordinate decisions across a network, to maintain information advantages, these have been made less valuable by technology, by more efficient markets, by regulatory structures that reduce the advantages of personal relationships. The modern Rothschild banks compete in areas where reputation and expertise still matter, advising on mergers, helping wealthy families manage their assets, providing strategic counsel to corporations and governments. They're good at what they do, respected in their niches, but they're not dominant, not the first name that comes to mind when people think about powerful banks. That distinction belongs to larger institutions, J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, HSBC, banks that operate at scales the Rothschilds never attempted and probably never desired. There's something almost elegiac about the modern Rothschild story, a sense of a great dynasty continuing but in diminished form. Like aristocrats maintaining their estates but without the power that once came with the title, the family remains wealthy, remains engaged in banking and wine and philanthropy, remains conscious of their history and legacy. But they're conscious too, surely, that the world they once dominated has moved on, that finance is now a game played by massive institutions with millions of shareholders rather than by family partnerships with ancient pedigrees. The conspiracy theories persist, remarkably. Despite all evidence, despite the obvious reality that the Rothschilds are not secretly controlling global events, the myths continue to circulate. They've adapted to new media, internet forums, social media, conspiracy websites. The specific claims evolve, but the basic narrative remains the same narrative that emerged in the 19th century. The Rothschilds are secretly controlling governments, manipulating markets, pursuing some sinister agenda. This persistence tells us something important about conspiracy theories generally. They're not really about the Rothschilds at all. They're about providing simple explanations for complex phenomena, about identifying enemies who can be blamed for social anxieties. When people feel economically insecure, when they distrust institutions, when they're looking for explanations for why the world feels chaotic and unfair, conspiracy theories offer clarity and certainty. The Rothschilds, because of their historical prominence and their Jewish identity, continue to serve that function for certain people, regardless of the actual reality of what the family does or doesn't do. The family's response to conspiracy theories has been largely to ignore them, which is probably the right approach. Engaging directly tends to give conspiracy theories more attention and credibility than they deserve. The people who believe the theories aren't going to be convinced by evidence. If they were open to evidence, they wouldn't believe the theories in the first place. Better to focus on actual business, actual philanthropy, actual life, and let the myths circulate among those who need them. What remains of the Rothschild legacy? Certainly wealth, though distributed more widely across descendants than in previous generations. Certainly businesses, the banks, the wine estates, various investment vehicles. Certainly a name that carries weight, that opens doors, that connects to history in ways that few family names can match. But perhaps most importantly, what remains is a story. One of the most extraordinary family stories in economic history, a narrative of rise and adaptation and survival across centuries of dramatic change. The Rothschilds demonstrated what was possible for Jews in European society when barriers lowered even slightly, what could be achieved through talent and coordination and calculated risk-taking. They showed how private capital could enable state power, how finance could shape the physical transformation of continents through infrastructure investment, how a family network could function almost as a multinational corporation before such institutions formally existed. They also demonstrated the limits and costs of success, how achievement could make you a target, how integration was always conditional, how the society that embraced you could turn hostile with terrifying speed. Today, the Rothschilds are neither the omnipotent puppet masters of conspiracy theory, nor the forgotten relics that complete decline would make them. They're somewhere in between, successful but not dominant, wealthy but not uniquely so, famous but perhaps more for historical reasons than current power. They've adapted to modernity while maintaining connection to tradition, transformed their businesses while preserving their name, continued despite losses that might have ended a less resilient family. They remain, in their own way, remarkable, even if the nature of that remarkability has changed from what it was in Nathan's London or James's Paris. Let that complexity rest. The distance between myth and reality, between historical importance and contemporary position, between what the family was and what it has become, and so we've travelled together through centuries, through the rise of a family from a narrow Frankfurt street to palaces across Europe, through triumph and tragedy, through the building of empires and their dissolution. We've witnessed how human ingenuity can create networks that span continents, how ambition and adaptation can transform circumstances, how success brings both opportunity and vulnerability. We've seen that history is never simple, never purely good or bad, but always complex, always human, always shaped by forces larger than any single family or fortune. If you've drifted away during our journey, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. The details don't matter now. What matters is that you're comfortable, that your breathing has slowed, that the weight of your own day has eased just a little. The Rothschilds, like all of us, were people navigating their time as best they could, building what they could build, surviving what they had to survive, leaving behind a story that reminds us how much can change across generations, while certain truths about human nature remain constant. Let the story fade now. Let your thoughts drift like autumn leaves on still water. Wherever you are in the world, whatever brought you here tonight, you're exactly where you need to be. Thank you for sharing this time, this slow journey through history. Sleep well, dream gently. Good night.